You're watching Open Agenda. Here's our host, Joe White.
Welcome to Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. With me in studio is our executive producer, Joe Venosa. Joe, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Joe.
So I want to talk about the county council meeting that we just had on Tuesday, September 17th. And that led into a press conference by the county executive on Thursday, September 19th. Let's start with the county council meeting. This was a 10 a.m. meeting, their second one for the month. One of the hearings they had to start the meeting off was basically allocating the current downtown library property as surplus. And this is part of the process to ultimately move the library out to Shoemaker Pond. Is that right?
Correct.
So we also had Director Hirschberger get up there and ask for the $330,000 in operating money to get the design and engineering done. They're applying for the state grant that they hope to hear, yes or no by the end of April. They feel like the library has a much better chance of getting the state grants if they have plans in place and quote unquote shovel ready, right?
Correct.
So, there wasn't a lot of discussion there. All of that passed, fairly quickly. I think one thing that did happen is Councilman Holloway and two other councilmen did ask for an amendment to be put in that would essentially trigger that $330,000 for the library's engineering once the state grant was awarded.
Right.
But that measure ultimately failed 3-4. Once again, showing that open, transparent government, they're not always in agreement, and sometimes you can go out there and watch them fight.
And that's the thing, you get to see it happen at the very least.
And you could speak yourself. I mean, it was a hearing. You could get up there and talk.
Yeah, absolutely, as people did.
As they did, yeah. So, that part of the county council meeting went just right along the agenda lines that you would expect. But then I think one of the surprises maybe of the council was the internal auditor, Anjali Chantel, she's been with the county for about a year, maybe just a little more. She's been in the process of setting up workplace hotlines so people can report, financial abuse or even workplace abuse. She's been doing fuel audits. She's been doing equipment usage audits. But the one thing she did, and this was in conjunction with the HR department for the county executive, is they did an attrition and a workplace culture audit. So tell me a little bit about what you heard.
Sure. Well, what we heard from her presentation at the meeting, and then what we were able to read if you were actually predisposed to sit down and actually read the report, is you would have found some very interesting statistics and findings about what the auditor was able to uncover. And some of the more shocking things that I think people who we know in the community have been vocal, off the record about some of the major problems happening currently, is high rates of worker dissatisfaction, fear of retaliation. But the two numbers that really jumped out was that we have nearly 25% of our current county employees, and these are the only people who were willing to respond, because many people, as we know...
Yeah, it was about 60% response rate.
I believe so. And again, that means that there's a whole bunch of other folks who, as we know, have in some cases been concerned about even responding to those anonymous surveys, because I can tell you, even from my own experience in the workplace, there is a constant concern, even if there's reassurance from management, that those surveys are not necessarily truly anonymous.
They can be backtraced.
They can be backtraced, correct. So putting that aside, 25% of current employees reported being abused, bullied, or harassed, and 33% witnessed such behavior.
That's an amazing amount, especially when you consider that, like you said, some people just may actually be afraid, even though it's supposed to be anonymous, to speak up. Now, Anjali Chantel, she is a CPA. She is an auditor. They are, in their very nature, unbiased. She is a by-the-book kind of person.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I trust her inherently. But then out of this came a press conference that the county executive held, and we attended, that seemed to be spurred by this report and some of the bad information that was in there. Again, that came from the HR department of the county executive's office.
Correct.
This is not, in the press conference, I feel like the county executive insinuated that the numbers were manipulated.
It's interesting because this is in line with something that's been apparent to many of us in the community. If you sort of watch the internal workings, the county executive made a series of statements last year that her argument was that the auditor was being weaponized against her office. That was the term that was used in even one piece of literature that she left for the county right after the referendum was put on the ballot. But what's equally troubling about this particular assertion is that if you read Ms. Chattel's report, it actually says that there was noted hostility by the executive's office to her internal reporting. So
And that's very significant, right?
it is, because it was almost at the maximum level of the rating for concern.
Okay. For Ms. Chantel.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So that was something that really should concern people, because what it means is that even the legally required ability to dive into an internal audit to examine what's going on, the response from the executive office was hostile. Yeah. So the idea of transparency and oversight is something that clearly seems not to be valued by certain entities of our local government.
It'll be interesting to see if this hostility can persist as she works through other parts of the county government. And this is all in an effort to make sure that fuel's being used for what it should, equipment's being used for what it should, personnel's being used for what it should. This is not a witch hunt. This is basically to make sure our tax dollars are spent where they should be.
This is fundamentally about not only where our tax money goes and how it's spent and is it being spent appropriately and legally, it also is about what's happening to our employees, because again, we do have an amazing, obvious crisis in the sense of we have one of the biggest vacancy rates in Maryland County government. We have had several high-profile resignations and departures recently from people who have accumulated collectively hundreds of years of institutional knowledge. We have a lot of these concerns coming out in the survey about abuse and harassment. And if this were any other institution, if this was a university or if this was a private business where these kinds of numbers came out, it would be an absolute front-page scandal.
Yeah.
It says a lot about the state that we're in this county right now under this executive form of government.
Well, speaking of maybe some questionable uses of county time and everything, during this press conference, it seemed like it turned into a campaign against Question A, which is very interesting because this is shown on PAC 14. This is obviously in the county council chambers. We went from a press conference to talk about employee retention and all the good that's happening to Question A.
Yeah, it was a transition because the first 4 or 5 minutes were kind of your basic sort of corporate PR empty language. I think George Orwell would have been proud had he watched that. But then when the transition to a campaign issue came up, I think you really got to see what I would view as the actual ulterior motive of that press conference.
Yeah.
And I hope that people realize that regardless of where you stand on the issue, right, whether you think we should keep this position or not, when an official calls a press conference on an issue specifically about employment retention, salaries, benefits, employee-related issues, and then immediately sort of sandbags the local media and local citizens with an ulterior motive that is then revealed quite openly, I think we should be concerned about that.
Well, there was one other these that was brought up, and I think we're going to see a lot of this. The escalation of personal attacks. Now, in the county executive's mind, these were personal attacks against her. We've heard that many times. I think we should be very open that we're expecting actually these attacks to come towards our group and towards the folks who want to vote for Question A.
Well, and ironically, the executive herself alluded to the fact that several elected and unelected officials have received hate mail recently. Not necessarily threats, but there are concerns that certain people who are perhaps very committed to keeping this position are increase or upping their rhetoric, if you will, in ways that are not always healthy or productive.
Well, today's guest is going to be Bob Taylor. He's a retired local attorney. He even spent 3 years on the county council as their attorney. His time there overlapped with the end of Bob Culver's term and the beginning of John Pesota's term. So he was there for the scandals that Bob Culver had with Michelle Ennis, the finance director, the forging of documents, the firing of HR director, all of that, lawsuits that came out of that.
I'm noticing a pattern here.
Maybe, yeah. But we're going to have a chance to sit and talk with him about the history of the executive position, how the revenue tax cap came to be in conjunction with the executive. And then Dr. Bowsert, retired from the University of Salisbury, his op-ed in the Salsbury Independent, really, I think Bob Taylor tells the other part of that story. So I hope everyone sticks around and gets a little bit more information there.
Absolutely.
So when we come back, we're going to sit down with Bob Taylor, retired attorney from the Wycomico County and former council attorney under Bob Culver and John Pesota's terms. Stick around. Let's see what he has to say about Question A and the referendum coming up in November. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. With me in the studio is our guest today, Mr. Bob Taylor. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm here.
So I want to find out just a little bit about yourself. I've heard that you've been a county resident for over 50 years. Is that right?
That's what I always say. I guess I'm a kind of a semi from here now, although I grew up across the bay. But I've lived here for, I think it's 53 years now.
I think after 50 years, they give you your from here pin,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So you're a lawyer, is that correct?
I've been a lawyer. I'm more or less retired now with handling one or two matters, and that's about it.
How long did you practice law?
Actively practiced where I went into the office most days, about 45 years.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
And you spent 3 years as the attorney for the county council?
I was the county council's attorney, y'all, it was 2017 to, I think, early 2021.
And who was the county executive while you were serving as the county attorney?
When I first started, it was Robert Culver.
Okay.
He passed away, and then John Pesota was appointed as the active executive.
Okay.
And I ended during his tenure.
So you got to endure all the fun with the finance director and the forging of documents back at that time.
Yep, saw a lot.
Yeah. So, we're obviously here to talk about Question A, the county executive's role in the county government. I want to get some history. Why in 2024? How have we gotten to this point? I mean, the county's been around for 150 years.
Well, let me say this. I was kind of working on that for perhaps an article in the Salsbury Independent. And lo and behold, I think it was Julius Caesar's ghost once said, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum today. And there was an article in this week's Independent by Dr. Harry Basehart.
And who is he?
He's retired now, I believe. He had many years professor of political science at Salsbury University.
Okay, so he knows a little something about county
he knows
politics.
quite a bit about it. I was able quickly to fact check what he wrote and found out I would have given him probably an A+ for that. I would like to explain a few more things and maybe add a little bit more grist to the mill.
Okay.
But his article that's in the Independent, I would recommend that to anyone to get. It's available at different places around town. And I'll also give a shout out to the Independent for publishing this and other things.
I think they've the Independent's done a nice job of being balanced and giving different points of view.
The new, I don't know if editor, but it's Richard Keynes, is doing a really good job.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. So what was your favorite part about Dr. Basehart's article, and where do you feel like maybe it fell a little short?
Well, I wouldn't call it falling short because he had limited space to write on. But some things that might want to be amplified for people. He starts at the earliest part talking about what's called home rule. And so people know what that term means. It means where a higher jurisdiction allows lower jurisdictions to have authority. Mm-hmm. And it's especially used in terms of states and counties and municipalities, because counties and municipalities are essentially political subdivisions of the state. The state controls them. And it's a little different from the control under the Constitution, federal government, and the states. It's more extensive than that.
Yeah.
And what we did in Maryland it's been about 120 years ago now, roughly, they started giving the municipalities and the counties more authority. They did that for a couple reasons. 100 or so years ago, it was pretty hard to get to Annapolis. And you had to go, cities and counties had to go to Annapolis to get legislation passed by the General Assembly.
There was no bridge.
Yeah, and no bridge and not very many good roads either. Also the General Assembly was log jammed with this stuff.
Okay.
Because, there are 24 separate jurisdictions, county level. There are now 150 plus municipalities, I think at least 100 back then. And they all had to come there and get this done.
So why is that
yeah.
important to our county now?
Well, it's important to our county now because I want to explain what's happened. What they did, they gave all municipalities home rule. They amended the Maryland Constitution. And just a historical note, Maryland's initial Constitution was passed before or adopted before the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
Many of the states had their own charters and constitutions before then.
Yes.
So anyway, that's first the municipalities. That was automatic. Then they did it for the counties. The counties however, had to pass a referendum with the county electorate to go to what's called the charter system,
Okay.
which we have.
Okay. So we obviously passed that referendum 100 years ago.
That was in, I think, 1918. They changed the Maryland Constitution.
Okay.
Baltimore was the first. They did it for Baltimore City. Baltimore City is essentially a county-level jurisdiction. It's not within any other county. And then other counties have come along. We went, as Dr. Basehart points out, to the system in, it was 1964, we did. Howard County, which is where I grew up, they went to it in 1968.
Okay.
And so, there was a trend, and it's now, I think, something like 12, if you include Baltimore City, jurisdictions that have a charter form of government. There are, just incidentally, there are other forms. Initially, every county had a commissioner form of government, county commissioners. There's still 6 counties that have that. There are also 6 counties that have a modified form of home rule called code home rule.
Okay.
And they can pass that without having to have a full referendum.
Okay.
So what we have is 12 counties with charters.
Okay. And we're one of those.
6 code home rule. Worcester County, for example, is code home rule. And then we have still commissioner counties. And I have a list here somewhere. There are a couple that are larger than we are. Washington County, for example. Hagerstown's the county seat. They're still a commissioner county.
So they still have to go back to Annapolis to get legislation passed.
Yes and no. For some they do, but over the years, the General Assembly has given more and more authority even to the commissioner counties. Mm-hmm.
So I think part of your point and Dr. Basehart's point is county government is always evolving. We've heard our current county executives say many times this is somehow a regressive move. That's not accurate.
I wouldn't say so.
What's more accurate is if you look at the history of the state of Maryland, from our Constitution that is older than the U.S. Constitution, to right up to today, when we're going to have a referendum this November to vote for question A, you have modifications to how county governments work, and they don't all work the same. We should do it the way that benefits us the most.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that, of the 12 counties that are chartered, including Baltimore City, 2 of them, Dorchester and Talbot, which are charter counties, do not have an elected executive.
Okay.
Most of them do. When they went to that form of government, they went to the elected executive system.
But most counties that have an executive, we only have a few in the state, have large populations.
Yeah, if you get down to the 10 that are left that have an elected executive, including Baltimore City, they're all at least 2 to 3 times larger than we are in population, some of them 10 times. You have Montgomery County, Baltimore County, I think they're both over 1 million in population now.
And we're barely over 100,000 here.
Yeah, we're barely over. I mean, just to give you an example, Howard County I mentioned, they changed in 68, we changed in 64. At that period, mid-60s, the population in both counties was the same.
Wow.
It was in the 50s, 60,000 range. Now, we're at 105,000. Howard County is 330,000.
Well, and
Now, but let me elaborate. I think anybody with common sense knows it's not because they have an elected executive. It's because they're located between Baltimore and Washington.
prime real estate.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So
So we're a much more rural county. We fit in with
Always
more,
have been, yeah.
Yes, and we fit in more with
Yeah.
rural counties without an
Yeah.
executive. Before we go into some more of the history, I want to talk a little bit about the electric that you talked about just a minute ago. In the last 20 years, has our population number, the total number, has it changed much?
Well, I'm only speaking now of the registered voters. The population has changed some. As I said, in the 60s, we were about 50,000, a little over 50,000. We've roughly doubled in that period of time.
Okay.
Whereas Howard County is essentially
Off the charts.
well, almost 10 times. Yeah. But of the voting population in 2004, which was when we went to the elected executive system by a referendum, there were, I'm using Dr. Basart's numbers, I think it was roughly 44,000 registered voters. They all didn't vote, but there were 44,000 who could have. Today, there are about 66,000.
Okay.
So we've had a 50% at least
And new
more.
registered voters.
Now, then you have to look at the attrition of the 2004 voting pool. And there are actually there's some data, and I've used it from the state Board of Elections that gave breakdowns. Unfortunately, it's only for a couple years, but they broke it down into cohorts, age cohorts, 18 to 24, let me look at them, 25 to 44, 45 to 66, and 66 and older. Now, let's just talk about the 66 and older in 2004. That was 20 years ago. That cohort would now be, to assume they're still alive, would be 85 and older.
Yes.
Now, it's a logical assumption that a lot of that group that's now 85 and older has passed away since 2004. And that's true of the other cohorts too, although not as much because they're not as old.
I think one of the numbers you've referenced before is over 40% of the electorate here now was not here in 2006.
Yeah, I've used these numbers from 2010 and 2012, the state numbers for Wicomico County, breaking it down into these age cohorts that I mentioned. And I've used some logical assumptions for attrition. And essentially, as they go older, get older in the cohorts, death is a more significant factor.
Of course.
There's also a moving away factor, too. I mean, some people do leave.
Oh, yeah.
And so I would say right now of the 66,000, probably somewhere in between 30 and 35,000 were here in 2004 as registered
about
voters.
half,
Yeah. So it's in the range of 40 to 50%, probably 45 or a little higher.
So I take away 2 points from the numbers you just said. County governments in the state of Maryland they're ever evolving based off the needs of the county.
And the voting cohort is always changing.
And our voting electorate right now has changed significantly since we had the last referendum that the county council brought to put in a county executive. I want you to stick with us for another segment. I want to dive a little bit more into the admissions or the assumptions that this is somehow a power grab, how the revenue cap came into being just before the county executive's position. Would you stick around just a little bit longer so we can dive into that? We'll be right back after this. Stick around.
The Winterplace Park and Equestrian Center is Wicomico County's largest recreational facility, totaling more than 380 acres. Located near the intersection of Old Ocean City Road and Hobbs Road, next door to Beaver Run Elementary School, this park is a unique combination of sports fields, horse training center, hiking trails, and picnic facilities. The 18-acre Wicomico Equestrian Center portion of the park was originally developed in the early 1970s as Winterplace Farm by James Bradley Kane, a real estate developer from Ocean City, Maryland. Winterplace was used for the training of thoroughbred show horses, mostly hunters and jumpers, and quickly became one of Maryland's preeminent horse training centers, winning more than 30 championships in Class A shows and 100 blue ribbons in 1972. Today, the facility is used by the Wicomico Equestrian Club and consists of 2 barns housing 52 stalls, a recently renovated carriage house, 3 jump courses, and 4 rings. Plenty of horse trailer parking with electric hookups is available. If you're a fan of active sports, Winterplace Park has everything you could hope for. The park is replete with baseball, softball, soccer, lacrosse, and multi-use fields, and is one of the hosts of the USSSA Eastern National Girls Softball Tournament every year. You'll also find basketball, tennis, and pickleball courts available for your use. If you're looking to have a family gathering on a pleasant summer day, Winterplace has a picnic area with grills and a pavilion, as well as public restrooms. And hikers will enjoy the 3.2-mile up and back walking trail that traverses through thick forests interlaced with streams and non-tidal wetlands. Among other events hosted at Winterplace Park is the Wicomico County Fair, held the third weekend of August each year. This free event is among the best county fairs in Maryland, featuring great food, music, livestock shows, and my personal favorite, the Maryland High School Rodeo Association competitions. For more information about Winterplace Park and Equestrian Center, this is Mike Goldberg for Open Agenda. Back to you, Joe.
Welcome back to Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. In studio with me for another segment is Mr. Bob Taylor, who's a retired attorney from Wicomico County. Thank you for sticking around.
Sure.
So I want to spend some time talking about the history of the property tax revenue cap that was put in place just before the county executive's position was created in 2004. Can you give us a little bit of history of just that timeline, how that progressed?
Yeah, and Dr. Basehart does this too in his article, but basically in the mid-1990s, we ran into a situation where there was reluctance to increase the tax rate. At that time, there was still some stagnation from the early 1990s. There was kind of a slowdown in price appreciation of your home, so the assessable base wasn't going up a lot. And we got to the point where I believe it was 98 or 99, where they had to raise the taxes a lot. It was about 20% of what was the existing tax rate, so it went up by 20%, which is a pretty large jump, and that triggered a reaction.
A major reaction, right?
Primarily from the Republican Party.
Yes.
There was a group called Voice, VOICE, that was formed, mostly Republican. They pushed through the tax revenue cap. It went to referendum and was passed. I think that was 2000. And it kind of kept going. The momentum kept going after that.
So,
And well, let me finish. There was some thought that we'll really make sure we don't have any more big tax raises. Not only will we have the cap, but just in case somebody want to play funny with it, we'll have an elected executive.
okay.
And under the charter, the elected executive sets the budget and the tax rate under it, and the county council can reduce things but not increase. So they can make it lower. So, I mean, essentially, the county executive sets the level maximum. The county council can reduce that sum.
Now, ironically, our very first county executive was Rick Pilot.
Yeah.
And Rick actually spent a lot of his time actively trying to break through the revenue cap. Is that accurate?
That's true. I think there's a little history to that, and we had the 2008 recession, you'll remember.
Yes.
And what happened, property values dropped tremendously. So not only was the tax cap holding revenue down, so was the assessable base was dropping. You can only increase the tax rate up to 2% in any 1 year. So it was dropping by more than 2%, and we were essentially stuck on this. We went through a lot of our reserve funds.
Okay.
We had furloughs of county employees. I mean, it was a tough time for a couple of years.
But we did get through it.
We did get through it, that's right.
And then even since then, we've had 3 other executives, 2 that are elected, 1 that was appointed after Bob Culver's
Right.
passing. Has there been other attempts to break through the revenue cap from the executive's office?
I'm not sure there's been any significant one.
Okay.
Because essentially, to really get it done and end the tax cap, you'd have to have a referendum vote. You would have to go to referendum.
Unless it's a Board of Education funding.
There is, in state law, you can override the tax cap if the override goes to education. Yes, there is an override for that.
Now, this past year, our assessable rate, just for the county side, went down 2 cents. But because of the county
Well,
executives,
no, our tax rate went down.
our tax rate
Yeah,
went down.
The assessable base went up. That's why,
You're
so,
right.
yeah.
So the tax rate went down 2 cents.
Yeah.
But because the county executive insisted that the Fruitland Primary School be funded the way it was, our tax rate could have gone down 4 cents. Is that accurate?
I'll have to stop and think about that one. What they did for Fruitland School, they needed $20 million and change. And initially, I believe the county executive wanted to bond all of that, wanted to go to the bond market. And rates for even muni bonds and government bonds are a little higher than they've been the last decade.
Yes.
People on the council were concerned about that, and they worked out finally a split. In fact, they approved at this week's meeting of the council a bond issuance for $10 million for the Fruitland School, and the other $10 million is coming out of county reserve funds.
So how about this notion that having the referendum to eliminate the executive position, and by the way, our current executive would finish out her term for the next 2 years, but how about the notion that this is somehow a power grab?
Well, I mean,
Why is that inaccurate?
let me put it this way. We have periodic charter review committees
Yes.
every 10 years when it jives with the census, the 10-year census. The first one that was done in 2011, I believe it was, the county executive forum had only been in for a few years.
Okay.
And there had only been one county executive, Rick Pollitt.
Okay.
They more or less just said, well, we don't know, there's not much history, we're just going to say it's okay. Well, the second one, 10 years later, in 2021, they were charged with the county council to review the entire charter, every nook and cranny. They took a buy on the county executive forum. And the reason they took a buy on it was because there was a feeling that the voters had voted it in, and therefore the voters should be the ones who change it.
Isn't
Not
that
us.
Isn't that what we're going to do in November?
Well, I was going to say, and that's to me, and I haven't talked to every council member, but that's why I think they decided, well, you know, if that's the way it's to be, and we've now had 18 years of experience under 3 elected and 1 appointed county executive, we have enough experience to know whether it's been a good fit or not. I happen to think no, but I mean, there are probably some that do. I would just point out, we were talking about the attrition in the 2004 voter pool. Again, I'm using Dr. Basart's numbers. There were 19,506 who voted for it then.
Okay.
If you use the same attrition rate, that is now down to maybe 14,000, 13,000, somewhere in that range of people who voted for it in 2004 who are now part of the 66,000 voter pool. So it would be like maybe 22%,
Yeah.
20 to 25%. You know, these are estimates and not hard numbers, but nevertheless, they're based on solid reasoning.
So some of the basis of having a referendum is from the Charter Review Committee, the County Council listening to that advice, and also some of the feedback they've gotten from the County Council meetings themselves.
I can't speak to county council members. I'm not in their mind, but I mean, that's what it looks like to me.
The last point that I want to talk about was there's been say that, well, we need to keep this because this is like the federal government. What's wrong with the basis of that argument for a county our size?
I think there's a short answer. Look at the federal government.
Do we want to be like
look
them?
Look at Congress, and you know, in other words, it automatically breeds for tension when you have a single person and then a group. Now, maybe we need that at the federal level because wars get declared, other things happen where you need a strong person at a particular time. Possibly even in the state. It's the same way in the state. We have a governor, we have a two-body House of Representatives and Senate, just like the feds do. But do we really need this where essentially the furthest you'll be from the county seat is maybe 20 or 25 miles? We don't need that.
Yeah.
And most counties do not have it in the United States.
We're in a minority that's under 20% of the total counties in the United States, and
Yeah.
most of that minority has large populations. So this is definitely something that the voters deserve a chance to make their voice heard.
Maryland's always been a mystery to me because you have a group of counties, they're the metro core counties across the bay. They have this. And I've always thought, well, maybe it's because they're close to Washington. And you just kind of see what's going on in Washington, and we want to be that way. And that was part of the reason I think that it was sold in 2004. Oh, we just want to be that way. We look over there, there's Montgomery County, it's growing 100,000 a year, and it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. It was growing like gang fire, roughly 10,000 a year. So every 10 years, it was going up by 100,000. So, and that's I think the genesis for it. There was never really, in my opinion, a good discussion and looking at other counties and what's happened, and for that matter, just looking at Sussex County. They don't have this form. They have an appointed county administrator.
So you attend a lot of the meetings. You've listened to the county executives over the years speak, address the Board of Education, or address the county council. I want to ask you a very simple question. Do you think having a county executive in Wicomico County is the best service for the residents and the taxpayers of this county?
In my opinion, no, and I think 18 years has shown it.
Okay.
I mean, I could get into the weeds about things that have happened. I mean, for example, a former county executive, not the current one, tried to get a deal with the state to turn the old Poplar Hill Correction Facility that's been vacant for years and is derelict into a drug treatment center. That would have cost millions. And the county has no experience at that. They would have had to hire somebody to run it. And I mean, that deal almost got put together until the county council found out about it and put the kibosh on it.
So in the neighborhood out in Quantico, they would have been surprised.
They were plenty much unhappy. I can
Similar
tell you.
to maybe the Shadow Hills community getting a surprise with an MOU. I think it's a common denominator that spans across all county executives, that their mission, their ambition sometimes supersedes what is really necessary and what's needed for the county. So
I mean, now we're seeing it for the liquor dispensary. The current executive, apparently one of her life missions is to get rid of our liquor dispensary system, which generates about $1 million of revenue for the county every year.
just at the legislative breakfast this week, that was the #1 legislative item on our county executive. Not how the roads are, not the schools, not the blueprint for education, liquor dispensary.
Exactly. That's been one of her goals. And I think we know why. I won't get into that. That's getting into the weeds, and I'm sure she'll have her say on that.
You're going to be at county council meetings coming up. If people want to find out more, if they go, they can speak their own mind. They can also listen to folks with generational experience like yourself there speak very articulately about all sorts of matters. I've heard you talk about everything from libraries to airports to everything.
If you want me to, I can talk about raising cattle and hogs.
Okay.
Because I did that as a kid.
Maybe in October we'll come back. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to come speak with us and with me, and I wish you well.
Yeah, sure enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sticking with us here at Open Agenda. That's all for our show today. We'll be back next week with another episode. Have a great weekend.